I'm going to reveal a bit of the history guy history that might surprise you. I learned to drive in a 1976 Ford Pinto. I know, you're thinking you're way too cool for that. I mean, surely a Corvette at least, but no. It was an orange Ford Pinto that had fake wood paneling on the side for style. And if you were born prior to 1980, you might be wondering, but how did you survive? Because we all well know the Ford Pinto had design flaws. It meant that if it got hit from behind by another car or just a really strong wind, it would explode into flames. And how the car that Ford described as the little carefree car that was built to be as indestructible as a Model T came to be regarded as one of the most dangerous cars ever built is history that deserves to be remembered. Before the term subcompact car was coined, there were small car manufacturers in the United States. The Crossley Corporation, for example, produced lightweight cars between 1939 and 1952, but as the big three automakers started to mass-produce larger cars, the market for Crossley collapsed and the company folded. From the 1950s onward, various small cars like the Nash Metropolitan, built in England for the American market, and especially the Volkswagen Beetle were imported, finding a niche in an American market dominated by larger automobiles. Volkswagen even stressed its odd design in its marketing campaign, saying, "Think small." By 1970, Volkswagen's American subsidiary Volkswagen Group of America sold more than 500,000 cars from more than 1,000 dealerships, capturing 7% of the U.S. car market. American manufacturers began to take notice of the trend and develop their own models. The first to be released was the American Motors Gremlin, released in April 1970 and described in marketing as the first American-built import. The auto review website Victory and Reseda notes that the Gremlin arrived in 1970 to the curious and the guffawing. Did anyone notice that the Gremlin was half a Hornet two-door? Yet the Gremlin made respectable sales, in excess of 25,000 in its first abbreviated model year. A 1971 edition of Popular Mechanics noted that there's a definite flair about the Gremlin, a unique personality, owners say. But when surveyed, the number one reason given for purchasing the car was economy. Chevrolet entered the market in the fall with the Vega, a highly touted car. Motor Trend magazine named the Vega the Car of the Year in 1971, design that ran into many difficulties, the subject of another episode of The History Guy. Writing in Business Ethics Quarterly in 2005, John R. Danley of Southern Illinois University notes that it was not a foregone conclusion that Ford would produce a Pinto. The discussion was because the small car market is rarely profitable, and American automakers were debating whether to try to compete with the small imports or just to ignore that space and focus on more profitable lines. But Lee Iacocca, then executive vice president of Ford Motor Company, championed the idea of Ford producing a subcompact. Iacocca had been at Ford since 1946 and had participated in the design of several successful models, notably the Ford Mustang. Iacocca's argument was not just competition in the subcompact car market. He reasoned that if Ford competed with the imports in that market, it would make it more difficult for those imports to gain a foothold in the United States and build things like dealerships, and thus they wouldn't be able to compete as much in more profitable markets. Two, if a person started out buying a Ford as their first car, then they might be more likely to buy another Ford as they traded up. The Pinto was considered to be Iacocca's project, and it was a victory for him when the board, in January 1969, approved the production of the car. Danley explains, given the extremely competitive environment, Iacocca imposed the 2,000 rule, i.e. the Pinto could weigh no more than 2,000 pounds and cost no more than $2,000. Iacocca knew that other American manufacturers were producing their own models, and thus, Popular Mechanics notes, he required a delivery deadline of just 25 months, a record at the time and still impressive today. Writing in the 1992 edition of the journal Management Decision, authors Marilyn Helms and Betty Hutchins explained that when a decision was made to produce the Pinto, it was given the shortest production planning schedule in history. The directive came from the top, President Lee Iacocca, who emphasized that the Pinto was not to weigh an ounce over 2,000 pounds and not cost a cent over $2,000, and that safety was not a priority because safety doesn't sell. A court would later determine that Pinto, however, was a rush project, so that styling preceded engineering and dictated engineering design to a greater degree than usual. Among the engineering decisions dictated by styling was the placement of the fuel tank. Named after the pony with bright spots, Victory and Reseda explained, this was Lee Iacocca's idea, though instead of adapting a global platform, the European Escort to be exact, it decided to go all-American. The result was a unibody construction with small dimensions, lightweight, a 4-cylinder engine, a choice of manual or automatic with a coupe, and a wagon available. The design was also sold under Ford's Mercury brand as the Bobcat. The car's exterior design by Ford's Robert Eidson saw some controversy. While the June 1972 edition of the San Bernardino County Sun offered a compliment, the Pinto was a great example that a small economy car doesn't have to be ugly. A 2009 edition of Businessweek listed the Pinto as number 8 on the list of ugliest cars of the last 50 years, although to be fair, the Gremlin was ranked number 6. The Ford Pinto debuted at the Chicago Auto Show and went on sale September 11th, 1970. Initially, only the sedan version was available, but a hatchback version went on sale the following February. Ford marketed the car as the little carefree car. Advertisements explained that Pinto was one little car that can free you from your car cares, big and little, from cares about high price and big gas bills, from cares about maintenance and repairs, power and stability, roominess and quiet. The little carefree car takes care of all that. Noting that it had more interior space than the Volkswagen Beetle and was priced like little economy imports, Ford said that the Pinto was a little better idea from Ford. The initial reaction was positive. Victor and Reseda write that with the Gremlin receiving some giggles and the Vega being slapped with recalls, the Pinto seemed to be the winner amongst the three. By 1974, more than 500,000 Pintos were sold. But, Victor and Reseda continue, things seemed to be going great until someone got rear-ended in a Pinto. The introduction of the Pinto came at a crossroads in terms of automotive regulations in the United States. In 1966, consumer advocate Ralph Nader had published the book Unsafe at Any Speed, The Design and Dangers of the American Automobile. The book posited that American automobile manufacturers were reluctant to spend money on safety and resisted efforts to regulate automotive safety. The book changed public attitudes and was the best-selling nonfiction book of 1966. The book and others spurred Senate hearings that resulted in the creation of the U.S. Department of Transportation and several agencies intended to establish and enforce highway and automotive safety standards. Those agencies would be combined in the Highway Safety Act of 1970, which created the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA. Danley writes that in 1969, the new agency released a proposal for new regulations to address issues of post-crash survivability. These included requirements for fuel system integrity. These were at the time mere proposals, released for comment under the rules of the 1946 Administrative Procedures Act. Ford and other U.S. manufacturers responded during the comments phase. Danley writes, on September 19, 1973, Ford submitted Petition for Reconsideration of Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard No. 301. Attachment 2 contained a cost-benefit analysis conducted by 2 engineers at Ford. The report considered the costs and benefits for society of the proposed regulations regarding fuel tank fires. That attachment would come back to haunt the company. Meanwhile, Ford began testing in anticipation of the new regulations, starting by testing modified Ford Mavericks, and then in 1970, the first model of the Pinto. Danley notes that while the testing demonstrated vulnerability of fuel integrity, there were no federal performance standards at the time, and proposed regulations addressed only front-end collisions. Moreover, Helms and Hutchins write, tooling went on at the same time as product development, so when testing revealed a serious defect with the gas tank, the $200 million Pinto tooling machines were almost completely built. Ford decided not to address the problems found in their crash tests. In 1970, Ford decided that the model year 1973 Pinto would satisfy the proposed standards from 1969, but no regulations had yet been promulgated. By then, the NHTSA was proposing stricter regulations, including requirements for rear-end collisions and rollovers. But the new standards wouldn't be effective until the 1977 model year. Danley writes that the 1974 Pinto was already in production, and Ford decided against modifications in the 1975 and 76 Pintos. Notably, Ford had solutions to meet the new standards, but chose not to implement the changes prior to the regulations coming into effect. Ford would come to regret these decisions. Danley notes that by 1977, Ford was embroiled in a legal and public relations nightmare. Approximately 177 legal cases were filed against Ford based on death or injury following failure of the fuel tank in the event of a rear-end collision. Among the most important of these cases began in 1977 regarding an accident in May 1972. Grimshaw versus Ford Motor Company. Superior Court Judge Stephen K. Tamura explains, a 1972 Ford Pinto hatchback automobile unexpectedly stalled on a freeway, erupting into flames when it was rear-ended by a car proceeding in the same direction. Mrs. Lily Gray, the driver of the Pinto, suffered fatal burns, and 30-year-old Richard Grimshaw, a passenger in the Pinto, suffered severe and permanently disfiguring burns on his face and entire body. Grimshaw and the heirs of Mrs. Gray sued Ford Motor Company and others. The judge notes several issues from the case. That styling dictated design, placing the fuel tank behind the rear axle where it had far less crush space than in any other American automobile. That crash test during design demonstrated that the Pinto's fuel system as designed could not meet the 20 mile per hour proposed NHTSA standard. But Ford produced and sold the Pinto to the public without doing anything to remedy the defects. Disturbingly, the judge noted that Harley Kopp, a former Ford engineer and executive in charge of the crash testing program, testified that the highest level of Ford's management made the decision to go forward with the production of the Pinto, knowing that the gas tank was vulnerable to puncture and rupture at low rear impact speeds, creating a significant risk of death or injury from fire, and knowing that fixes were feasible at nominal cost. He testified that management's decision was based on the cost savings which would inure from omitting or delaying the fixes. Following a 6-month trial, a jury awarded Grimshaw $2,516,000 in compensatory damages, and the Grays $559,680 in compensatory damages. Most notably, though, the jury awarded Grimshaw $125 million in punitive damages. Punitive damages were thought at the time to have been the largest award ever in a U.S. product liability and personal injury case, but the judge reduced the punitive damages to $3.5 million. Still, it was by far the largest punitive damage award in the history of the state of California at the time. Ford appealed the judgment, but it was upheld. After the judgment, Ford decided to settle other cases out of court. As the trial was proceeding, Mother Jones magazine published an article called Pinto Madness. The article paid particular attention to the attachment 2 that had been included with Ford's 1973 appeal of the NHTSA regulations. Danley writes, Attachment 2 contained a cost-benefit analysis conducted by 2 engineers at Ford, E.S. Grush and C.S. Sonby. The report considered the costs and benefits for society of the proposed regulations regarding fuel tank fires. Mother Jones' interpretation of the attachment was that Ford waited 8 years because its internal cost-benefit analysis, which places a dollar value on human life, said it wasn't profitable to make the changes sooner. According to Mother Jones, Dr. Leslie Ball, who had worked at NASA, said that the release to production of the Pinto was the most reprehensible decision in the history of American engineering. And Los Angeles safety expert Byron Blosh opined that Ford made an extremely irresponsible decision when they placed such a weak tank in such a ridiculous location in such a soft rear end. It's almost designed to blow up. Premeditated. Mother Jones estimated from NHTSA data that between 500 and 900 fatalities resulted from Pinto fires. The article received a Pulitzer Prize. Many of the claims made in the Mother Jones article were repeated on an episode of the CBS television show, 60 Minutes. In 1978, Ford agreed to a voluntary recall of some 1.5 million Pintos and Bobcats, despite the Pinto meeting relevant NHTSA regulations. But a year later, about a third of the vehicles recalled had not received the fuel system modifications. While there were no significant issues identified with the 1979 Pinto, by then the car had gained the reputation of being unsafe. Sales declined, and 1980 was the last production year. In total, more than 3.1 million units were produced between 1971 and 1980. The Pinto has long been regarded as a keystone case in corporate ethics and product liability. Danley writes that with respect to moral reasoning and blame, the case is routinely viewed as a slam dunk, no-brainer. Yet analysis after leads to some surprising conclusions. In a 1991 article in Rutgers Law Review, Gary Schwartz of UCLA Law School concludes that several significant factual misconceptions surround the public's understanding of the case. Given the cumulative force of these misconceptions, the case can properly be referred to as mythical. First, Attachment 2, often described as a crass corporate calculation of the value of human life, has been entirely misconstrued. Professor Lee Vinsel of Virginia Tech University explained in 2021 that the document was not about Pintos. It was not about rear-end collisions, but about rollovers. It was not about lawsuits, and was not aimed at internal design decisions, but external regulatory rulemaking ones. The attachment did not give a cost calculation of the cost of lawsuits versus the cost of addressing the Pinto fuel issue, but rather used a standard NHTSA value to consider the cost of the new regulation across the industry. Importantly, not only did the attachment not, as Mother Jones suggested, place a dollar value on human life and decide it wasn't profitable to make changes. In fact, it did not reflect internal decision-making at all, did not assess potential deaths in the Pinto due to the fuel design, and had no impact on internal decisions regarding the Pinto's design. Further, Mother Jones' assessment of 500 to 900 fatal accidents was the result of completely misunderstood NHTSA data that represented not deaths due to Pinto fires, but industry-wide rollover fatality data. The actual number was not 500 to 900, but 27. In August of 1978, the state of Indiana filed a criminal suit against Ford based on the deaths of 3 teenage girls who died when their Pinto was involved in a rear-end collision. The state argued that Ford's actions amounted to reckless homicide. According to an Associated Press report defending Ford, Harold McDonald, Ford's vice president of engineering, argued that the decision to place the fuel tank behind the rear axle was sound because the gas tank should be as far from the engine as possible. In the company's defense, he offered a startling statistic that challenges the entire fire trap image. A federal study showed that in 1975 and 1976, 1.9% of the nation's cars were Pintos, and 1.9% of the fatal accidents involving fire, an average of just 13 per year, occurred in a Pinto. Despite its fearsome reputation, the Pinto's record in fire fatalities was average for subcompacts. And in terms of fatalities as a whole, the Pinto fared approximately even with the Vega and Gremlin, and significantly better than the VW Beetle. Denley concludes that in light of the facts as we know them, there's little evidence that there is even a kernel of truth to the myth of the Ford Pinto. Writers Matthew Lee and David Ehrman contend in a 1986 issue of Presidential Studies Quarterly that the Pinto narrative is largely the result of a post-Watergate journalistic fever, in which conspiracy and moral calculations and organizational wrongdoing were regularly being highlighted by reporters. People like to throw around the term historical revisionism, but in fact, history is being revised all the time as we gather new data or gain new insights based on the perspective of history. That is the discipline of history, and perhaps an overdue revision is to admit that all the horrible things we heard about Ford Motor Company and the Pinto in the 70s and 80s might well have been overstated. The monster might not have been as monstrous as we once thought, even if the car's reputation continues. Thus, the great controversy of the Pinto. Yes, Ford designers knew that it had design flaws that might cost lives, and they didn't address those design flaws, but the reasons for those decisions might not have been as malicious as we were once told. And the car's reputation as a fire trap and a death trap is clearly overstated. The fact is you were just as safe in a Pinto as you were in an AMC Gremlin or a Chevy Vega, and probably safer than you would have been in a Volkswagen Beetle. But exploding the myth of the Pinto might lead many of us children of the 70s and 80s to wonder if our entire childhood was a lie. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.